those who don't, I'll give a little background in that. And then I'm going to look at 3 particular studies I've looked at that look at the use of nostalgia by football clubs, or the perception of fans about nostalgia, or both. And what I'm aiming to do is see to what extent the way fans appreciate nostalgia, the way they feel nostalgia, to what extent is that matched up with the way football clubs seek to exploit it? Is it the case that football clubs are doing this properly, or is it the case it's all a little bit hit and miss? So I'll start off talking about exactly what nostalgia is. The idea was first conceptualised actually back in the early 18th century by a Swiss physician called Johannes Hofer, and it was something to do with ship, long journeys by ship. Also a link into sort of visiting armies as well. The idea was basically around homesickness. This is what he was, in a sense, talking about: people who were very sad a long way away from home, and symptoms that were noted were bouts of weeping. That's a good terminology. And he coined this thing, nostalgia, basically. And for a very, very long time, nostalgia, because of that, was seen as a negative thing. It was a negative emotion. It was linked to grief, melancholy, depression, as I said, particularly homesickness, a psychological distress. So if back in the 1900s you said, I'm feeling really nostalgic, people would have come and patted you and said, really sorry about that. Have you just left your home, or have you just gone through a big transition phase in your life? And so that theory, that conceptualisation held sway for the next 2.5 centuries, basically. Even up into the mid-80s, there were plenty of papers being published in which that was the way nostalgia was sort of coined. And it was only towards the end of the 20th century that that perception changed. The lot of the work I'm going to reference, if you're interested in reading up on this, really the guy to read is a guy called Konstantin Sedekidis at the University of Southampton. He and one of his colleagues, Tim Wheelshire, have pretty much defined the literature on nostalgia for the last 15 years. And I've put a few of their references in here, but you could pretty much read any of their content and it would be pretty interesting. If you're interested in nostalgia, these guys have nailed it. And for a series of experiments, they're experimental psychologists, they showed that actually nostalgia is not necessarily a negative emotion. Actually, it's largely positive. It's linked to positive outcomes. It's something that's social. It's not an inward-looking feeling of homesickness and doom and despair. So before I come back and talk a little bit more about their work and how we define it, a few definitions. And these definitions reflect that more recent work regarding that nostalgia is not entirely negative. So the first one from the Collins English Dictionary, a yearning for the return of past circumstances. The sense of the past in that is established about, people know that. But equally, pleasure and sadness that's caused by remembering something from the past and wishing you could experience again. So it's not just a negative sense that this happened in the past and it's gone forever. It's a sense that this was something really good that happened. And then the last one, a wistful desire to return in thought or in fact to a former time in one's life. So there's an element of sentimentality. That's the a sentimental yearning for the happiness of a former place or time. Here's Konstantinos Sedekidis' definition. It's a co-authored paper actually. He and his colleagues define nostalgia as a predominantly positive, social and past-orientated emotion. In nostalgic yearning, one brings to mind a fond and personally meaningful event, typically involving one's childhood or a close relationship. Now, it's important to remember that because I'm going to come on to try and link this into how a football fan would perceive nostalgia, or how their footballing supporting part of their life would link into nostalgia. And the idea of childhood, or particularly a close relationship, is one that will come in. The person often sees the event through rose-coloured glasses. We could say that a lot about football sporting anyway, misses that time or relationship, or may even long to return to the past. Consequently, the person feels sentimental, most often happy, but with a tinge of longing. A few sort of further notes about nostalgia. Firstly, research has shown that it's defined similarly across national cultures. So if you asked someone in East Asia, or you asked someone in a Latin nation to define nostalgia, they would come to a similar conclusion. Secondly, it can be a collective feeling. So we can feel nostalgia in terms of a group identity. You can feel nostalgic for experiences that you may not have personally been part of, but they're experiences that were experienced by that larger group that you see yourself as part of. And again, that's relevant as a football fan, because obviously you see yourself as amongst a group of supporters. And finally, they can be experienced second-hand. Now, again, that's very relevant for football supporting, in that I think most clubs, pretty much all football clubs, have histories that go well beyond the lifetimes of their current fans. And there's a tradition of support being passed down through relatives, through generations. So there will be people who will experience, and even more these days, I guess, younger fans will see clips of action, clips of events that are mediated via video, online, YouTube. Spend time mucking around looking at old Watford goals from the 1960s and 70s. And so Holbrook, anyway, Maurice Holbrook, who's a writer on nostalgia within consumer culture, argues that you can experience nostalgia secondhand, is that someone will pass on and say, this was a great thing that happens to your football club, or your country, or your family, and then you can feel a sense of longing for that, even though you weren't actually there. I guess that ties into the sort of collective nostalgia feeling as well, but this is more particularly that temporal gap going back in time. Okay, that's sort of outline of what nostalgia is. What about the actual content of nostalgic thoughts? So again, Sedekides and Wilshire have looked a lot at this. There's been other authors who've written about this. And what they've found is that primary content tends to be personal experiences of friends, relatives and partners. Sharing things with friends and relatives is incredibly important. There's a definite bias towards shared events as opposed to purely personal experiences. So again, if it's momentous life events, they're more likely to be ones that you shared with friends, relatives or partners. These nostalgic thoughts are characterised by positive emotions. So it's not typical to be looking back and thinking, oh, I'm really nostalgic for that time that I broke my leg, or I'm nostalgic for that funeral or something. It's not like that. But eventual nostalgic thought can feature negative emotions. So if we're going to translate that into a football scenario, I guess it would be quite likely you'd be nostalgic for a big game your club were involved in, even though maybe you eventually lost. So you would have experienced that disappointment of losing, but that big day that you shared with other fans would be something you'd look back on. Finally, I think critical again, a couple of researchers, Havlina and Holack, who've wrote quite a lot about nostalgia 20 odd years ago now. They looked at content in terms of sort of what activities you were doing. Do people get nostalgic about work? Do people get nostalgic about family life? Do they get nostalgic about leisure? And they found a bias towards leisure. People are far more nostalgic about leisure than they are about work. Now, I guess that comes partly from the idea it's positive things that we tend to nostalgise about, but it's not entirely that. People are happy at work, but it does seem to be that leisure activities are more important, and that may well tie into, again, the idea of shared experiences. Though, of course, you have shared experiences at work. They don't necessarily confound each other completely. Right. So, we've talked about the sort of things that are in your thoughts. What about the era they come from? What eras of your lifespan? And this is where we come to talk about the reminiscence bump, the reminiscence curve. or the lifespan retrieval curve is the technical name given to this. And this is a way of conceptualising the eras of lifespan that you most often recall. Essentially, the eras of a lifespan you most often recall are those in which memories are most strongly imprinted. And this has been studied, and numerous studies have looked at this in different ways, individuals, cross-culturally, by age, by gender, and they found that it's not a straight line. It's not the case that you just recall things that are more recent better than things and it gradually tails off into the past. It's not like that at all, actually. You are more, if you take the recency aspect out of it, as in the last 4 or 5 years, you take that out of it, then you are more likely to recall things that happened to you from between your childhood, so I guess early teens, through to your mid-late 20s. That's a rough period. That varies a bit by culture. The variation by culture seems to be linked in terms of the ways different cultures conceptualise adulthood. So, an example in this graph here, in East Asian cultures, then adulthood is thought of as starting a bit later than in the West, and therefore you can see in Japan their peak lasts slightly longer than, say, the peak for the US or for the UK or for Bangladesh. There's been some specific, just a little few specific bits of research to throw in here. Morris Holbrook, again, he looked at consumers' music taste for pop songs. I think that's something that's been looked at in this series of seminars as well, pop culture, and they looked to see what was the age at which people were most likely to have their favourite pop song from the past at, and that fell in the early 20s. Okay, so that's nostalgic content. Tends to be positive, tends to be linked to social events and momentous occasions, but tend to be positive things. They tend to be events that would have happened somewhere in our teens and our early 20s. So what triggers our thoughts about these things? Well, research has shown that it tends to be feeling down, feeling a bit depressed. Negative affect is the psychological term for this. That tends to trigger nostalgic thoughts in us, particularly dimensions of loneliness and dislocation. So ending, living somewhere, moving somewhere else, being on your own. Unsettlement, real word, is it? Feeling unsettled. And there's been some evidence, I wouldn't say it's overwhelming, that people retrieve nostalgic memories to counteract negative feelings. So this is almost a purposeful thing. Other triggers of nostalgia: social interaction, so conversation with friends. So again, this is something that's very easily generalisable to football, the sense that you can be in the pub before the game and you chat about past stories, whether it's the Grey Cup tie or being chased by hooligans down the road. It doesn't have to necessarily be things that were positive at the time, but you put a positive slant on. And that social interaction is often with people who are also the object of the nostalgia. So someone, if you're talking with friends who you experienced games with many years ago, you meet up with old friends, went to a game with them 20, 30 years ago, then you'll probably start talking about that. Finally, sensory experiences. I'm not going to talk so much about sensory experiences today, that's almost another topic in itself. But yeah, sound, views, smells particularly, I think, is very quite thoroughly researched. Okay, who experiences nostalgia? Does it change by age or gender? Well, Yes and no. Doesn't appear to be a major difference in the amount of nostalgia experienced by different genders, though the content varies. Given that nostalgia is related to positive and negative affect, that's the way people feel, whether they're happy or sad, we would expect nostalgia to be felt most in life periods where people are less satisfied. So that's why I've put this plot up here. This is the life satisfaction plot. Actually, a guy who I work with, Peter Waugh, he's a researcher in satisfaction and happiness. Over the course of his about 50 years researching this stuff, he's collected so much data, he's come up with this curve which reflects when people tend to be happiest and saddest in their life, and they tend to start off sort of an average level, and they are saddest in their early mid-40s through to their mid-50s, and then they will get very happy until they get to their mid-70s, and then it might drop off again because they might be a bit too ill to be happy. But that's known as the happiness curve. And I think it's really very relevant here, because if nostalgia is related to how you feel at the time, then it's likely you're going to feel a bit more nostalgia in this middle bit. Okay, so said what nostalgia is, said the different things that people can be thinking about and things that can trigger it. What's the value in triggering nostalgia? Why would this be of interest to the more cynical out there? Well, there's extensive literature on this in the marketing and in consumer psychology. I'm not going to plough through all of it. But essentially, the outcomes of feeling nostalgia, we've talked about what causes it. What happens afterwards when you feel nostalgia? It's been shown to boost meaning, attachment, optimism, social connectedness, well-being, and it makes you more likely to buy stuff in some cases. Again, I said Morris Holbrook's a very good reference for this if you want to look at the exploitation of nostalgia in advertising, but it's something that's been going on for many years. Particularly in terms of sport, nostalgia has been shown to enhance allegiance and attachment to a sports team. It's a paper by Daniel Funk and Jeff James that I've mined extensively in my statues research, and they looked at what predicted attachment. There's a long established measure of attachment to sports teams by a couple of researchers called Wan and Daniel Wan, I can't remember the same other guy, Wan and Branscombe. And they used that, and they collected data on nostalgia that fans felt, and they also collected other things that might predict attachment, like the team being any good, there being a celebrity star player and stuff. And nostalgia was one of the two main things that predicted the extent that people would subsequently feel attached to their team. So there's clearly value in a sports team trying to encourage nostalgia among its fans, because essentially they're going to be more likely to stick with supporting them and probably spend a few quid in the club shop as well. There's also, and I don't really think this has been researched in any detail, I mean I've looked at it from the statues point of view, but the idea of triggering nostalgia to just distract from a less successful and over-commercialised presence. If you have fans who are not particularly happy with the way the team are playing, or they're not particularly happy with the state of the game as a whole, if you can link your team in to a better past, make them think about a better past, it might just make them overlook a few of the current sins. So in a way, that is taking the idea of negative affect of individuals, causing them to feel nostalgic. It's turning that on its head and saying, well, the club has negative affect at the moment, or the collective fan base has negative affect. We want to encourage them to experience nostalgia to overcome that. So, as well as there being evidence that nostalgia increases attachment to sports team, there's also a lot of evidence of sports teams using nostalgia. Now, whether they're doing it in a scientific way, in a sophisticated way, where they actually thought, we're going to do this because it will make people more attached, or whether they're doing it in a less targeted way and thinking, well, fans seem to like this stuff, let's get it out there, then I'll talk a little more about that later. I think it's inarguable that in American sport, it is done in a fairly sophisticated way, or it's certainly developed over time in a sophisticated way. There's a deep literature on this, and it's largely in the area of sports tourism. So actually, to research this stuff, you have to jump across a lot of different literatures to get your head around what's going on. But the sports tourism literature highlights a lot of the heritage offerings that clubs, sports teams are now producing, getting out there, and the impacts of them and the motivations for it. It's worth noting that heritage does not equal nostalgia, or heritage does not automatically cause nostalgia. Heritage can be over a lot further period, and it doesn't necessarily have to be targeted towards inducing nostalgia. But nostalgia is intrinsically linked to it. And if you're interested in some sort of quantitative evidence for this, then as well as the sort of stuff I've done around statues, then a paper by Seafried and Mayer, 2010, they basically went around Major League Baseball and NFL teams, just counted all the heritage referencing type stuff. So murals, statues, footage on video screens, museums and Hall of Fame. But they also looked at stadium design, which is something I'll come back and touch on a bit later, which is something they've certainly done in America, and it's very, very clear evidence they're thinking about inducing nostalgia in people. Within UK football, which is obviously the focus of this talk, is there a lot of evidence of this? Well, there's a long history of what I call occasional and ad hoc events that might generate, would be expected to generate nostalgia. So for many, many years, football supporters clubs have had end of season nights where they get an old player to come along and talk. And why would they pick an old player? Because he's someone that the fans would like to see again. It's tapping into that idea. Bring back good memories of when he used to play. Or get excited by that again. But it's first important to say, I don't believe that is being done to generate nostalgia. Secondly, these sort of things were generally done by football supporters clubs. If I didn't want to inundate you with too many slides, I'd put a few posters for these stuff on my slides. But these are things that are not organised by the official club. In fact, one of the pieces of evidence I'd cite to say that football clubs using nostalgia is a very recent, or relatively recent thing, is that simply before the mid-1980s, football clubs, very few of them had what we'd recognise today as a marketing department or a commercial department. They just didn't do that sort of stuff. In my research into football shirts, I've found very much, well, deal like this. Arsenal basically had a hole in the wall to the early mid-80s. Watford, my team, they had a trestle table on the terraces. This is not sophisticated stuff, and it's certainly not going to extend to a head of marketing sit down and think, I want to re-release the retro shirts from 1969 this year because I think this particular group of fans will tap into that and it will really get them excited. It's just not been going on in any sophisticated way. But it has become more frequent recently. You can certainly identify the start of the Premier League era as a kicking off point for this. But even since then, whether we could say it's actually particularly sophisticated or targeted is debatable, and I will talk about the evidence for and against that as I go through. What you can say, as a sort of brief review of the back end of this, is that football clubs were producing nostalgic videos from the mid-1980s. Not before then, because videos didn't really kick off till the early 80s, full stop. No one had a video player. Halls of Fame and club museums, obviously a classic marker of the use of leveraging heritage. Manchester United was the first one in the mid-80s. Arsenal, early 90s, Liverpool, late 90s. You see, this is all relatively recent, and these are the biggest clubs. The vast majority of football clubs in the UK still do not have a Hall of Fame or a museum of any sort. I visited Chesterfield's archive the other day. It was a shopping trolley in a cupboard in their community room. That was it. No sense that the public would be anyway want to see this, look at it, be interested in it at all. It was a big pile of shirts and programmes and cuttings. It was incredibly non-organised. So yeah, still only a handful of clubs have these, and it's typically only those that offer regular stadium tours. They want something as a destination at the start or end of the stadium tour. And essentially those clubs have positioned themselves as sports tourism destinations. It's worth saying there actually, if the club's positioned itself as a sports tourism destination, then essentially the fans it may be targeting leveraging heritage at aren't its regular fans. They're the overseas market who may be visiting, or just tourists coming to that town. I mean, again, Arsenal's a good example of here. If you go up to the Emirates and hang about for a weekday, there's a lot of people milling around there, going on the stadium tour, looking at the murals, but I suspect not many of their regular fans from their surrounding area, because they're probably all at work. Another marker, obviously one I know about, are statues. Again, this all ties in with late 80s, early 90s. First stadium-sited statue of a player in the UK, mid-1990s, which are Billy Wright up there at Wolves. Rebuilt stadia, obviously post-Hillsborough. Taylor Report, clubs start rebuilding their stadiums, and they tend to incorporate some sort of heritage referencing, stand naming or installations or decorations. Not many as sort of dramatic as the Arsenal rap and the Arsenalisation there, but that's a very good example of the sort of heritage referencing stuff you get. That's the Arsenal players with their arms interlinked. The second one along is Lewis from the 1930s. And to the left of him is Patrick Vieira from the 1990s. So these sort of boards, murals, sometimes information boards with brief histories of past players. There's a lot of this out there now. But what there is very, very little of, and I've got ideas about this, I think anybody's ever really researched why this hasn't happened, is what I'd say heritage referencing macro stadium design. So people are not building modern football stadiums that anyway look like old football stadiums. Now if you go to baseball grounds in the US, that's a picture of Camden Yards in Baltimore. It's probably not really big enough I was thinking about my bigger screen, I forgot whether I looked TV. But that's very much in the old style baseball stadiums of the 1910s, 20s, 30s, 40s. But that was built in the mid 1990s, the first one of these retro replica baseball stadiums, and within about 10 years the majority of baseball teams in the US had these stadiums, actually aping stadiums from the golden era of baseball. That really hasn't happened in the UK. The UK has built very utilitarian football stadiums, bowls, where the only difference is the colour of the seats. There's no incorporation in any sense of the club's history, heritage. There's no attempt to evoke nostalgia in fans of any age for our stadium design. Cricket grounds, don't know really. Haven't really. I think if you look, they've very gone down a modernist perspective. Edgbaston, the new pavilion at Edgbaston, big glass thing, stand at the Oval.
Wormsley's very...
Yes, but that's not really a commercial cricket ground. That's someone's private garden, really, isn't it? So, none of the new stands that are built, maybe Lord's would be the only exception that has odd bits in the design that you could say, but they're not major. They're minor touches. There's no overall master plan, is what I'm trying to get at anyway. Football kits. So that's the thing I'm doing the majority of my research on at the moment, looking at football kit design and then why adults started wearing them. So again, early 1990s, kit design begins referencing the club's heritage, but not necessarily in a nostalgic target, not in a targeted way. Again, it's a bit random, like laces on the collars. That's not going to be tapping into certainly a first-hand. It's not going to evoke first-hand nostalgia in anybody who was under the age of 80. I mean, I think it was back in the last time laces had been on collars had been back in the 1910s. I think Aston Villa kept it going for a while longer, but most clubs got rid of that ages before. So it was heritage, but it wasn't trying to evoke nostalgia. Retro replica kits kick off around the same time. They're not done by clubs initially, they're done by independent companies who see a gap in the market and see something that's not copyrighted they can make. Toffs, and Arkwright as well, I think were the first at the same time. And they again are trying to tap into this. But again, it's not by a football club. It's an independent commercial venture. And clubs now often have ex-players as half-time guests. Retro-themed match days have started to spring up in the last half-decade. That's an Everton advert from the Everton website. Retro Day returns for Villa. That's a very large man dressed in an Everton shirt with a tied-on collar there. I couldn't quite what's going on. Oh, he's throwing an old ball out, isn't he? This sort of thing. Now that's very similar to American sport. Retro-themed days at the baseball have been something they've been doing for 20, 30 years, where all the stewards dress up in old gear as well. It hasn't happened in UK football, sadly, yet. I'd like this. Retro-themed baseball days, the players will actually dress up and play in old kit. Again, I'd love to see that, but it's not good. That's not going to So, again, it gives the impression that it's piecemeal. Little things are starting to happen, but it's not what I'd say is targeted. So that's a little bit of a back end to what I then did. So I'm a statistician, so I like collecting data. So I'm going to talk about 3 separate data sets here. The first one is something I haven't really written up in any way yet, which was a survey of 122 fans who attended the last ever match at their club's home ground. Now that's the other team I support apart from Watford, that's Barnet. And they went to see their last game at Underhill, their old ground. And I surveyed some fans about their perceptions of support, about the nostalgia they were feeling, basically. The second study is going to look at the Reminiscence bump for football fans through the prism of their favourite kit. So if we can do this with favourite pop songs, I thought, well, we can do it with favourite kits. Same sort of idea, really. Something when you're growing up. So is it more sharply defined for particular ages? So I did a survey of fans, basically for my adoption of football kits by adults study that I'm currently writing up, but I threw in a question at the end about what's your favourite kit, and got them to look at the Historical Kits website, which I'll show you a picture of in a minute. And then the final study, just looking at my statues data, and also looking at a bit of the kit data as well. And the final study, I'm interested in to what extent are clubs actually heritage leveraging in a way that is coherent with evoking nostalgia. So is it the case that if clubs design kits to look like past kits, is this happening a lot, and also is it lining up with what would be a sensible gap to evoke nostalgia, given what we know about where people are, the point in their life they're most nostalgic and the era they're most nostalgic about, is this actually matching up? I did a similar thing looking at statues. So clubs are putting statues up, then is this appearing to be done to evoke nostalgia? If it is, are they targeting it right? Okay, so the first one was the study at Barnet FC. So that was the last game. Barnet Council, basically, not exactly slung them out, but hadn't helped the club stay there. And surveyed 350 fans standing outside the ground giving out a questionnaire. Got 122 back, which I was quite pleased about, really. I mean, he's going in the bin, but trouble is at Barnet, there's so few of us that you know most of them that have probably helped me in this occasion. So I collected some demographic data because I was interested in their age and gender. They collected their commitment to an identification with the club. There are established sets of questions that other people have used here. I didn't have to make most of this up myself and pilot it. Fortunately, there's work out there. Again, the group at Southampton, Sedekidis et al., they've developed a scale. Holbrook's developed a scale set of questions, that is, to measure stuff. So if you're ever interested in doing this, looking at nostalgia, there are resources out there to do surveys that you don't need to make up your own questions and wing it. Reasons for attachment to the club and attending. Topophilia, so the sense they were in love with the ground. So I had to remember here, this wasn't really about Barnet dying or anything. This was about them leaving the Underhill. So their nostalgia would probably be directed to things to do with Underhill. And then some questions about nostalgia as well, how nostalgic they felt. And the basic results from this. Fan nostalgia for the stadium was statistically significantly related to primarily the extent that fans attended for social reasons. fans weren't nostalgic particularly, or the sort of fans who were nostalgic weren't particularly those who were the oldest or the youngest. They weren't those who would describe themselves as necessarily the most attached, but it was those who attended games for social reasons. It wasn't those who attended for excitement, buzz of going on a Saturday. It wasn't those who attended to see the team win. It was those who went to football because they went with their mates, basically. And they were the ones who were more likely to feel nostalgic about the ground. So that links up very nicely with the earlier research on nostalgia. Secondly, the extent of a fan's commitment. The more committed fans, and that was measured in terms of whether they had a season ticket or not, they exhibited greater nostalgia. In a sense, that's trivial. I think that's sort of obvious that if you go there more often, you're probably more likely to have a bigger bank of memories to draw on. So that was, in a sense, preliminary study. I wanted to say what are the relationships between the way fans feel. And that's something I'd like to actually pick up and do in more detail somewhere else. It's just collecting the data for something like that's an absolute nightmare, standing outside a ground. You've got to basically get 20 mates to help you, and then you've got to hope they send stuff back. And doing that sort of thing online doesn't work because you miss the moment. So you have to do it there and then. So in terms of a bit of data collection, I'm much more proud of the data collection on kits, because it's a bit easier to do, but it was quite successful. So I did a survey on fans' replica kit buying behaviour, as I said, threw in a couple of extra questions about what's your favourite kit, also asked them about their age, the gender, the club they support, and they were given the historical kits website to look at. So just show you historical kits.co.uk. So when people went on to the questionnaire, when they filled in the questionnaire, the last question was, what team do you support? And then they were linked through to the website for their particular team, so it might be Burnley, and then they had to look down all these kits and just tell me which was their favourite. So they had a lot to choose from. So that's all of Burnley's kits. So, and they would go through and just fill in which year. You look astonished that people do this. This isn't the only website like this. If you're thinking, oh my word, the world of kit obsessives is worth a study in itself. Some people are very, very keen on kits. Anyway, that's what they had to do. Pick that out. Why football shirts? A bit more detail. Well, I think football shirts are an interesting thing to study because they've got the potential to evoke nostalgia in different ways. They're worn to games, so that's going to link you to particular moments, the moment you wore that shirt to a game. They're worn by players in great games, so you might be nostalgic for a particular great match. They're worn by great players, you might be nostalgic for a particular player, that will link in there. They may be given as presents, which provides a link to parents or loved ones. And they're worn to play football with friends when you're younger. So there's lots of links to the past in a football shirt that you may have owned. So this was my data from this, and I'll show you a few graphs here. This is probably the most complicated one, but this is simply plotting the person's age when they filled in the survey against the year their favourite kit came from. So I had about 3,000 people responding, and though it's not so clear, actually, because a lot of the dots are on top of each other, about 80% of the responses fall within these lines. The bottom black line is the line that matches the year in the respondent was born, so that's their current age. They're age 40, they were born in 1977, so across to here. The idea? So that line's going to go up like that. And this is the line that's the age, your current age linked up to the year in which you were age 25. Okay? So this gap between these two lines represents someone's favourite kit being a kit that was worn between their birth and them being 25. So it's clearly kits from when people were younger. If you ignore the fact, obviously people up the top end who filled it in, they weren't even over 25, so they couldn't put a lot in up there. Those kits haven't happened yet. But the data is there's much more data in between those lines than elsewhere. That said, when you get up to the older respondents here, the concentration in that gap is much less, which suggests perhaps older people are less feeling less nostalgic about certain things, or their nostalgia for that certain range of their life is less strong. So the next thing I did was calculate each respondent's age in the year their favourite kit was the current kit. So that's a more detailed look at the previous plot. So along the bottom here is the respondent's age in the year that the favourite kit was worn by your team. Now you can have negative years here because someone could favour a kit from before they were born. Okay, so it is possible that you could get someone, for instance, having an age when their favourite kit was worn by a team of minus 100. They like the kit from 1880. But actually what you see is very nice representation of the reminiscence bump. The peak seems to come around mid-late teens, basically, and then tails off. So that suggests that if we look at fans as a whole, that's all 3,000 odd fans we took, then their liking of kits matches the reminiscence bump. Maybe the peak slightly earlier than pop songs. Pop songs was in the early 20s. This is mid to late teens. I then looked at that data, but split by someone's current age. So what I wanted to do was see whether that effect that older people were less focused was actually coming out. And that is the case. So the squeezing together of the years into these into the years of your early teens is happening most for your 41 to 50-year-olds. And relatively so for the 31s to 40s and the 30s and under. But yeah, your over 50s, they're much less focused on what they're nostalgic about. If they are, if it's nostalgia driving this, the fact that there is no particular pattern in terms of their favourite kit suggests perhaps their kit choice isn't about nostalgia. They're actually looking at it and thinking, which one do I like out of these? Looking in a lot more detail. So that would provide evidence that actually older people, as you get over 50, 60, you're happier. As you get over 50 or 60, you're feeling happier, and therefore you're less nostalgic. And therefore that's less likely to drive your kit selection, your favourite kit. Obviously it's not just going to be nostalgia for a particular period in your life that might drive things. There's nostalgia for momentous events, and you can see this, I think particularly this came out in Brighton's data. So again, it's our 41 to 50-year-olds where there appears to be particular nostalgia for momentous events. This peak here, this was when 41 to 50-year-olds were 10 years old. So let's go back 40 years from now. And what's that? So they're 41 to 50, they're 10 years old then. Oh, come back, just in my head. So we're going back about 30 years from now. 30 years back from now, a little bit more, we're around the cup final Brighton were in. So this is a pickup of the 1983 cup final. So it's that momentous event that they're nostalgic for there, not just their youthful years. It's just one particular year it's all been squeezed up in. Whereas you can see the spread for West Ham, they had a couple of cup finals and they were quite successful in that general period, so there's a much greater spread across there. One particular year for Brighton. And then Brighton had another good little run in the early 90s when they got in the playoff final, and they had a particularly weird kit then as well. And that's stripes on the shorts, Tesco bag kit, Nobbo across the middle. I don't know who Nobbo were, some sort of early tech group, I think. The Tesco bag kit it was called anyway. And
yeah, thanks for that.
That's what that peak is there, I think. It's the Wembley playoff final we lost to Notts County. So people think back to that as a momentous occasion, because Brighton hadn't played at Wembley very much. So you can see that momentous events come in there as well. Okay, so that's looked at the reminiscence bump, and that does seem to work. What about actual football clubs targeting nostalgia? So I looked at the extent football clubs target nostalgia in a couple of different ways. I looked at their kit design and I looked using statues. So for kit design, what I did was for each of the 92 league clubs, I collected I took the data from that historical kits website for every year from 1888 and I coded up the kit. If anybody wants to do something with this data with me, because I've really used it now for the things I want to do, anyone that's interested in using this, I'm more than happy to share it. I divided the kit up into 14 elements, so it could be shirt colour, short colour, collar type, sleeve trim, etc. And then I plotted the presence of these elements and attempted to spot repetition in recent years. So if certain patterns come back in the last sort of 15, 20 years that were previously seen, is that the case, or is this evidence of there being sort of nostalgic content in the kit? Likewise for statues, I took the statues of footballers we had and I calculated the dates or the age of the statue subject and the difference from their playing career peak at the point the statue was erected. So the idea being, are we erecting statues of players from 30 years ago or 50 years ago or 100 years ago? I excluded players who died during their playing career because obviously their statue wouldn't be erected in an attempt to evoke nostalgia, it's erected out of sympathy. I also excluded managers and chairmen because their age ranges and their careers are a lot longer and it gets very hard to, you have to go through the entire data set and code that up, and for playing around with it in this stage, it wasn't worth that. I also investigated design type because again, if we're saying that the sort of things that evoke nostalgia, if clubs are really trying to evoke nostalgia, they'd be trying to get into that statue something that might be about a moment, a key moment, a flashbulb memory perhaps, that would get fans thinking, oh, I was there then, wasn't that wonderful? So why use statues and shirts to do this? Well, they're a nice contrast of soft and hard commercial strategies. Shirts are a very hard commercial strategy. You've got to sell the things every year. Statues are soft, they're something that people might get a glimpse of, they don't cost fans anything. They're also a bigger sample size than trying to use club museums to see if clubs are doing. I can tell you about club museums now, there's about 10 of them and they contain a lot of heritage content focused on recent years and winning trophies. But there's not really enough there yet to be able to say how well clubs are doing this. Whereas with statues and kits, it may not be such a good proxy as a club museum, but there's lots of them and you can count them. So analysing this data, I said I looked at these changes in shirts. In terms of the benefit, looking at shirts gives you particularly, there's something that's controlled by the club has power over them, huge economic value, long history, and they offer an opportunity to replicate the past. Very easy for clubs to nostalgise or attempt to evoke nostalgia with a shirt. Statues cost a bit more obviously for a club if that's going to be the route they would use to attempt to evoke nostalgia in fans. It's quite an expensive way of doing it, but it can allow particular memories to be prioritised. An oft-cited fact about statues is simply they tell you a lot more about the people who erect them than the person who's depicted. They enable you to prioritise certain things and hide certain things away. So they're an ideal way of evoking nostalgia. You could set up a statue of a player who was very popular, but maybe he did a few misdemeanours off the pitch. You don't have to put them in the statue. You can have him scoring the goal or lifting the trophy, and that's it. So here's some results. Shirts. So if you want a lot more detail on sort of the shirts and the design changes, I refer you to the paper I wrote on this. It was in Sporting History a couple of years ago, with Gene Williams and a couple of others. And this shows teams' kits over the years. And actually it's the recent bit I'm particularly interested in here, but just to describe the graph, these are different facets of shirt design. So I'm just looking at one element of kit here, the actual shirt design, and the patterning that's used on shirt design. So hoops, or halves and quarters, or different sleeves. None is just a plain shirt. Stripes, micro patterning. And the thing I'm particularly interested in here is the top end, really, because actually if you look in shirt design, over the years, starting in 1888 up to the early or the mid 1980s, kits are constantly changing, but they're never referring back to the past. It's always some sort of technical innovation in the fabric or copying an idea from abroad, and the kit changes, but it never looks back. Completely forward thinking, the football kit. All the way through from here. At this point we start abandoning the old amateur colours of chocolates and browns and things that are still on cricket caps these days, but chucked away by football around this point. And then we get rid of the tie-ups and the thing, and then we get better materials and shorter sleeves copied off the Hungarians around here, and then we start getting polyester and designed so children will buy them here as replicas, and then we get the fabrics coming in, and then we enter the crazy period of the late 80s where kits are just an absolute riot of sort of like a Jackson Pollock painting, really. But what's interesting is that in the early 90s, this period fades away, and by the mid-90s, clubs start referencing much more sober kits, and they actually go back to sort of here. But then, in the early 2010s, the patterning starts coming back again. And football kit design has effectively now entered a loop where it starts referencing older things. So here's some good examples of that. So Coventry City 2011 needed a new kit, and I think the clubs have to get a new kit out every year or every other year at the moment, and so they just ripped off their 1968-69 kit, promoted it with our glorious season of 68-69. It's their first year in the top division, I think. And yeah, the kit's a pretty good facsimile, really, I think. Notts County, I mean, this is an example of starting to reference the dreadful kits, or the dreadful, interesting kits of the late 80s, early 90s. So Notts County wore this barcode kit in 93-94. It was quite a successful year for them. 2013-14, they launched their new kit back to 1993, our heroes of 93, and they kit them out in a pretty identical thing, really. I mean, there's a slightly modern touch on the sleeves, but it's same idea. So this stuff's going on with kits, definitely, and it looks like clubs are getting a little bit more efficient at targeting there. I think if we think the nostalgia periods, I'll talk a little bit in the conclusion about when exactly they should be lining things up in a minute. Statues. Well, again, there's evidence here of clubs looking, at least being more nostalgic orientated rather than historical orientated than other providers of statues. You can think the majority of football statues come from one of three main sources. It's either clubs who just chuck the money in and say, we're going to put a statue up of so-and-so, or it's fans who get together and do lots of fundraising and say, we're going to put a statue of so-and-so, or it's civic authorities who say, we need this guy in the middle of our town to make our town look nicer, and we can't put a politician in there because everyone hates them, and we can't put a vicar in there because everybody hates them, and we can't put a royal in there because people aren't too sure about them either, so we must put a footballer because everyone likes him, so they'll put an old footballer in there. And club and hometown statues have got very similar profile in terms of the years after the career midpoint at which the player's statue was erected. So it looks like clubs, the subjects of club statues tend to be centred around 30, 40, maybe 50 years after their playing career. They're certainly not all dead. There's plenty of people who are alive get a statue. Yes, whereas there's a much greater spread for fan statues. So fans have done statues of players back in the sort of dark ages of football, talking the 1880s, 1890s. There's a broader spread of them, and they're a bit dislocated to one side as well. In terms of the designs, clubs are also more likely to have triumph designs, but that's not conclusive. They're slightly more likely to have triumph designs than fan statues. So the idea of celebrating a moment, by triumph design I mean one where the player's holding up a trophy or celebrating like this in a particular way that could be taken from a sort of flashbulb memory type photo. Action statues very rarely could be classed as flashbulb memory because it just tends to be a guy shooting, and even if it is taken from a particular photo, it could be any time he had a shot. Whereas if you think of, say, the statue of Bill Shankly holding his scarf like that in front of the Kop, that was from a very specific moment that if you're a Liverpool fan you could link to. Likewise, Fred Keener at Cardiff holding the FA Cup. It's a very long time ago, it was 1920s, but it's a specific moment. That has to be that moment where they win the Cup. So you can place that as being a momentous occasion. Okay, so to conclude, time. That's not too bad. A little bit long. Does the evidence fit with theories of nostalgia? Well, yes, in an admittedly limited sample from my Barnet supporters, social interaction and friendship does seem to drive nostalgia amongst fans, which would fit in with what we had before. If that's the case, and I guess this is the important bit, if that's the case, and that's what nostalgia theory says, that's what my sample says, I've extended the theory to a particular sample, it doesn't seem to be any different for fans, then clubs hoping to evoke nostalgia in fans, and I guess cash in on it, they should be looking to evoke memories of time spent with friends in some sort of way. There should be a focus on comradeship, the fandom. Also from the broader nostalgia theory, football clubs hoping to evoke nostalgia should look to evoke memories of memorable moments, trophy wins, comebacks, cup upsets, even amusing or notorious incidents. The sort of things you discuss in the pub, I would say, and the sort of things I often discuss in the pub and I hear other people discussing are as much, do you remember when so-and-so got sent off for a massive punch-up? Or do you remember when we were chased down the street? Now, I'm not saying that clubs can probably represent being chased by other hooligans, but there is that side of football that I guess would be not quite dark tourism, but grey tourism. From the second study, the Reminiscence bump is clearly there for football fans. That's a very nice match-up to previous theory on the Reminiscence bump, the lifespan memory recall. Centred perhaps slightly earlier than general studies have shown in terms of Reminiscence. And that bump is slightly sharper for middle-aged fans, suggesting maybe they feel nostalgia more strongly. That is, therefore, it's nostalgia driving that shape. It also matches what we'd anticipate given the happiness curve, that is, middle-aged people would feel this more strongly. And therefore that link between nostalgia and feeling a bit sad and depressed in your middle-age, midlife crisis type stuff. So if that's the case, football clubs hoping to evoke nostalgia should actually target the Reminiscence bump of middle-aged fans. So 30 to 40-year-olds, particularly 40 to 50-year-olds. They're probably the group with the most spending power and motivation to spend as well. I mean, they're not just going to buy a shirt for themselves, they'll be trying to buy stuff for the kids as well. So you hook them in, you've got money at the club shop. Now that would imply if clubs are going to target them, or they are targeting them, then nostalgic material produced should refer to an era 25 to 30 years in the past. Because if someone's 45, then they're nostalgic for being 15 to 20, then we're going to be looking back at that era. So if we take those findings of Study 1 and Study 2 and put them together and say this is what clubs should be doing, how does that match up with Study 3? Well, it matches up quite well with shirts. It seems that clubs, certainly in the 1990s, early 2000s, were fairly random where they picked retro designs to shirts from. So they might go back to 1880 or they might go back to 1960. But in recent years there's been a much more sophisticated return. I gave you the example of the Notts County one there, but then even some of the manufacturers, the return of pinstripes a couple of years ago, very much a mid-80s design of shirts, and they came back in a big way. So I think football clubs are thinking about that and getting that right. In terms of statues, not so much the case. I think partly because they're a less controllable variable. I don't think it's so easy for a club to say we're going to put a statue up so because he's just this right era. They obviously can't say. He's got to be a great player, and if your great player doesn't quite match up with the right era, and you want to put a statue up. Not all statues are motivated by commercial branding reasons. Some are, definitely. There's certainly an element in it, a reason for people to put the money in, but the original idea doesn't always come from that at all. clubs are perhaps more likely to commemorate moments than fans or civic authorities, but whether that's being deliberately done to evoke nostalgia, I don't think. I think a lot of it's boasting. I think Celtic have Jock Stein holding the European Cups. They're boasting they won the European Cup. I don't think that's about evoking nostalgia. And perhaps most relevantly, statue designs very rarely incorporate fan memories of the subject, particularly the inscriptions. There's very little to do with fans. And if what's driving fan nostalgia and making them feel more embedded to the club, which is what clubs want, is a lot to do with the social interaction, then there probably needs to be more incorporation of the social aspect that going to games with friends, maybe fan memories of a player. Arsenal do a little bit of that around the ground in terms of the murals, but Arsenal, interesting, got a professional branding company to do this. One of the very, very few who've done that and gone down that route. So there's probably been a bit more thought gone into it. Okay, that's it.